Firstly, it's a privilege to be one of the first people to read this significant publication, which reminds us of the common strands and themes across Southern Africa, but also importantly, I think, stresses some of the differences that exist as well. It's notable that this book does not simply address the situations in countries governed by former liberation movements, in South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Namibia. If it had focused on these countries alone, the book could have easily been subtitled Decline and Fall, a narrative that moves from a looter continua to the looting continues, with varying degrees of speed and pessimism. And while decline across a number of governance indicators does feature throughout, the book proves to be a deeper dive, a more nuanced account of the complex challenges facing 9 countries in the region. And so beyond the famous, sometimes some might say infamous, 5 of the ANC, MPLA, Frelimo, ZANU-PF and SWAPO, we are also given insights into the situations in Botswana, Zambia, Lesotho and Eswatini. The Economist Intelligence Unit, in its annual Democracy Index, reckons that more than a third of the world's population is subject to authoritarian rule, while only 6.4% enjoy full democracy. According to the EIU, democracy is now at its lowest ebb since the index started in 2006. In the EIU assessment, Botswana, South Africa, Lesotho and Namibia are classified as flawed democracies. Angola, Zimbabwe, Eswatini and Mozambique are seen as authoritarian, while Zambia is a hybrid regime. Freedom House, in its 2023 report, paints a slightly rosier picture, with Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, Zambia and Lesotho said to be free, while Mozambique is partly free, and Angola, Zimbabwe and Eswatini not free. Still, the overall conclusion is that the wave of democratic liberalization that started around 1990 in Africa is now in retreat. But as this book reveals, indexes are only part of the story and are a fairly superficial indicator of what is happening in the various democracies that we have in the region. The situation is often complex and nuanced, and also dynamic. So things are changing. Whether things fall apart remains to be seen. For example, no one can with certainty predict where the process of generational change will take us. While the old guard will stubbornly hold on for some time yet, the reins of power will inevitably and eventually come into the hands of a more youthful demographic that dominates population numbers across sub-Saharan Africa. To summarize some of the key features that the book identifies as being prevalent in dominant party states, we have a number of factors. The staging of unfree, corrupt, or I would say sort of dubious elections, the blurring of the lines between government, the ruling party and the state, the erosion of civil society and clampdowns on the media, and stifled institutions, sometimes including the courts, but also key checks and balances bodies that often exist as constitutional institutions. I want to just briefly touch on the various chapters. I haven't really been with the book long enough to be able to write a detailed book review, so that's why I asked, say, these are more remarks on the book rather than a book review. But let me take you very briefly through the various chapters. Seppo Gwatiwa, in a chapter titled Botswana's Democratic Rigor Mortis and Freefall, finds that despite the country's historical roots in being in a diplomatic struggle rather than an armed struggle, so it's not a formal liberation movement-led country, Some of the outcomes in Botswana are familiar, with the emergence of a de facto one-party system and a consequent democratic decline. Henning Melba and Christy Kielder, in the two chapters on Namibia, consider a country where the liberation movement, for a long time, was seen as performing better than its counterparts in the region, in terms of electoral performance, but also in terms of governance. The sense that this has changed for the worse since 2015 is inescapable, with economic recession, corruption worries, and political fragmentation coming to dominate the national mood. The story that Anne Parkin outlines in her chapter on South Africa is similar to Namibia's, with the ANC widely expected to lose power due to corruption scandals, socio-economic challenges, and factional infighting. She doesn't say exactly when that might happen, but it is seen to be the trajectory in terms of politics in the country at the moment. Anne-Marie's chapter is called An Ailing ANC and the Fight for the South African Miracle. So miracle is a rather hopeful word. I don't think she quite explained how that might happen, but as far as I understand it from her chapter, this is based on whether South Africa can establish a democratic political culture that is not imposed from above or outside, but is intrinsic to its society. Much of this is about focusing on building lasting democratic institutions based on sound governance rather than personalities and parties that will come and go. And I must say that this is a theme that runs throughout several chapters in the book. R.W. Siwale and Biggie Joe Dambwa examine the case of Zambia's once dominant United National Independence Party, or UNIP, that's the party of Kenneth Kaunda, and why it lost power over the years, despite being seen the independence party of the country. And one of the things I'll note here is that the authors say one of the key factors was that UNIP neglected to include a mix of representative different generations appropriately in the party and in their structures. This is surely a warning to some of the increasingly atrophied dominant parties in the region. The idea that we have to move on and make space for younger generations is never an easy one for politicians, particularly the senior politicians, to accept, and is often a very highly sensitive issue. And of course we know this in Namibia. We see challenges from younger political activists, and a lot of them ease, but also a lot of determination to hang on to the levers of power at the same time amongst the what might be called the old guard or the liberation struggle generation. In his chapter on Angola, Alex Vines highlights the MPLA's deep-rooted sense of its own legitimacy and its Marxist-Leninist origins, which do not sit well with the tenets of liberal democracy. As Angola arrives at a fork in the road between remaining hardline security-obsessed state or opening up to whether Angola will be able to choose between remaining a hardline security-obsessed state or opening up to further democratic reform, some of which we've seen since the Dos Santos period ended, remains to be seen. And I do add a cautionary note here that in the last week we've been contacted by Angolan civil society to say they're facing a very draconian law, almost at the point of being introduced, but just needs the president's signature, that will seriously clamp down on civil society and will basically end its operations in terms of being free in a democracy. And so that hasn't received much publicity, so also alerting the journalists here to that development as well, that the tension between, if you like, the as I say, the military security-obsessed side of Angola and the possibilities of a burgeoning opening democracy are still to be resolved. One thing I liked about Alex's chapter on Angola was that I learned that the President Lorenzo is popularly known or commonly known as J-Lo. So it did raise the possibility that maybe we could apply other entertainment or singers' names to other leaders in the region. It might make them look a little bit more friendly and less frightening in some ways. But anyway, yeah. So J-Lo is not only Jennifer Lopez, but is also the president of Angola. Alex Vines also writes the chapter on Mozambique, and here he depicts a system in which the state and the party have often merged into one entity, a familiar aspect of post-liberation movement democracies. And he argues that opening up the democratic space is likely to be the better option than making key political decisions through elite bargaining, whether that's with Renamo, the significant opposition party there, or in terms of the disruption that is taking place in Cabo Delgado. The underlying theme of factionalism is explored in Motlameli Ekapa's chapter on Lesotho, which finds that despite 4 different parties being in power since the return to multi-party politics in 1993, internal party factionalism has actually ended up undermining democracy rather than helping to entrench it. Similarly, Mark Chingono and Alexander Rosero, in their chapter on Zimbabwe, find that division, factionalism, and purges have become the defining features of both the ruling party, ZANU-PF, and the opposition in Zimbabwe, contributing to toxic politics and the continuing authoritarianism which has bedeviled the country under ZANU-PF. Finally, Eswatini, as an absolute monarchy, is an outlier in the book, but still a very interesting addition, I think, to read about and see how it fits or doesn't fit in terms of the overall narrative. So Albert K. Donson-Lindsay uses critical theory to dissect Eswatini's neo-patrimonial system, highlighting the breakdown of the prevailing order and how increased dialogue points to a way forward for the country. All the authors offer valuable insights on their country's situations, but also cross-cutting themes, some of which I have referred to and will refer to just now. And what could be a confusing melange of perspectives is ably edited into a coherent narrative and volume by Professor Blau and Mr. Zaire. One of the key threads running throughout the book is the trade-off between the advantages of political stability, the much vaunted peace and stability in Namibian terms, and the consequences of political entrenchment, which all too often lead to complacency, stagnation, and corruption. But changes in ruling parties have also not necessarily boosted the fundamentals of democracy, as I mentioned in Lesotho. It's pertinent to note that of all the countries considered in the book, only Zambia and Lesotho have seen changes in ruling parties since independence brought about by democratic elections, and neither of these countries have become poster children for democracy. We can see this every day in Namibia. We really have no excuse to ignore the developments that are taking place in Namibia, because if we look over our southern border, we see a situation that should serve as a very graphic warning of where we are heading if we don't arrest the decline and start to turn things around. And of course, I'm talking about South Africa there. One of the issues where there is quite a degree of variance is electoral integrity, with Zimbabwe and Eswatini obviously at the bottom of the table, and South Africa, possibly Botswana, at the top. And I think Namibia not too far behind. Namibia's election results have often been disputed in the courts and after the elections, but actually thus far, and I know some might disagree with me, there's been little hard evidence of actual rigging taking place. Zimbabwe remains the benchmark for awfulness and hopes that Mnangagwa will be better than Mugabe have been cruelly quashed. To some extent, we have become inured to the sheer ghastliness of the leadership in Zimbabwe and the effect it has on the citizens of that country. And it's worrying at the moment because there seems to be little concern in the region or beyond about what's happening in Zimbabwe now, which is a run-up to an almost inevitably rigged election due to take place, I think, on August 23rd this year. We're not hearing very much about that from any of the usual actors, even. So I think one of the key questions that this book raises is it lays out in detail the historic contexts for these dominant party states. But the question now is what happens now and what happens in the future. Once the legitimacy of a party that led the liberation of a country starts to ebb away, what replaces it? And it's very clear that the certainties of the dominant party period are disappearing. So what does come next? My fear is that it is the chill winds of more authoritarianism. Will democracy remain not the only, but at least the main game in town in the future? I don't think the book is reassuring on these issues. Perhaps the best we can hope for is that we'll somehow muddle through. The present, I think one of the threats to democracy and democratic consolidation is the current economic conditions of many of these countries. So we are now in the midst of a cost of living crisis. Many of these countries are dealing with the bitter fruit of decades of economic mismanagement. We also have an unfair global trade and investment system and arrangements that do not ultimately promote development or democracy. And we have to remind ourselves, I walked through town this morning and saw many of the poor people in Windhoek huddling, trying to survive the cold, many of them without shelter. We have to remind ourselves that it's very hard for democratic progress or democratic consolidation to take place when the people are hungry and they're angry. The flip side of the dominant party is the incoherent, fragmented opposition party. So I think the book does address this in various of the chapters. As I said, several of the chapters, including on Lesotho and Zimbabwe, address the consequences of factionalism within parties. And it's often difficult to see any of the even strong opposition parties really presenting themselves as alternative governments in waiting. In some of these countries, they remain with the tag of rebels, obviously thinking of UNITA and Renamo, for being the historical opponent of the liberation movement. And sometimes the newer parties are just seen as new kids on the block who just have the temerity to challenge the entrenched status quo. They shake things up, they are disruptors, but not necessarily people you would say could govern the country even in 5 or 10 years. So as Christy Kielder points out in his chapter on Namibia, parties need to reform to restore public trust. And we heard already that the loss of public trust, as indicated by the Afrobarometer, is a major issue across these countries. However, I think for public trust to be restored, parties have to be reformed, intellectually, morally, and politically. And looking at Namibia at the moment, I have my doubts about whether we can go down this road. The reaction, not to clean up, but rather to make sure the tracks of the corrupt and other corruption scandals are more deeply covered and harder to deal with. So there's also no such signs of a self-correction in South Africa following a whole myriad of serious corruption scandals. And the cross-border elements of the Fala scandal indicate that moral bankruptcy spreads across borders in Southern Africa. Before I end off, I just want to comment a little bit about what's been happening in Parliament over the last week regarding the Supreme Court judgments on immigration issues relating to same-sex marriages and the introduction of the Private Members Bill by Jerry Kanja. think there was a very good opinion piece by Diane Hubbard in the Namibian on Tuesday, which highlighted the very serious constitutional implications of what happened in Parliament last week and early this week. Essentially, the rule of law and our constitutional democracy is under threat. And it's astonishing to me that, as far as I could see from the reports, only one MP, being Kalle Schleppwein, actually raised constitutional concerns around the private members' bill. But to be short about it, basically the Supreme Court is the interpreter of the Constitution, and once it has delivered a judgment which interprets the Constitution, in this case interprets the Bill of Rights, it cannot be overturned by Parliament. Now, Jerry Kanjo has completely misunderstood Section 81 of the Constitution, and he believes it can correct Supreme Court judgments, but it's established fact and well known, amongst lawyers, it should be well known more broadly, that once the Supreme Court has determined on a constitutional matter, that's not to be overturned or corrected by the National Assembly. The Assembly can address other matters, but not that. So it's a contrast between Section 79 of the Constitution and Section 81. And I think Diane's piece explained that very clearly. But what's shocking is that parliamentarians, some of whom have been in Parliament for, well, literally decades, do not understand the basics of constitutional democracy, or they are deliberately ignoring it because of the depth of their prejudice on this particular issue, and also possibly because they think it's a populist issue that might come up at the next elections that might affect their vote, because they perceive, and it's not proven, again, Afrobarometer indicates otherwise, that there is a large-scale prejudice in the country, very deep-seated against LGBTQ plus community. I don't have to say, I mean, you probably know that the Afrobarometer actually indicated that we were the third most tolerant country in Africa on this issue. In 2019, 64% of the surveyed people said they have no problem living next to having a gay and lesbian, or gay or lesbian neighbour. So, the idea that we're all, jumping up and down, as portrayed by some politicians and churches in a very sort of vicious anti-gay rights way, I don't think is necessarily held up by all the facts as we know them. But basically what we found was MPs falling over themselves to display their prejudices while demonstrating their ignorance of how constitutional democracy in Namibia functions. Now, I think I'm expecting, of course, the bill to sail through the National Council. It went through the National Assembly on Monday. The next step with the Constitution is that the President could decline to sign the bill into law and could refer it to the Attorney General for a constitutional assessment. That's all in Section 64 of the Constitution. So we hope that Namibia will still revert and re-emphasize its very strong and commendable history and tradition as a constitutional democracy through this. But what also shocked me in the parliamentary debates was that, yes, okay, there are older people very traditionally set in their ways and their minds who cannot accept certain things that are happening, that they perceive as unacceptable. But the young MPs, in fact, some of them were even more vociferous and more hateful in their language than their older colleagues. So I didn't see anybody seriously amongst the younger MPs raising the constitutional issues that this private members' bill throws up. So that does raise a worry about populism. That's, I think, a factor that maybe also needs to be looked at by academics in Southern Africa and how that will affect elections going forward, along with the factors that are affecting elections around the world now, social media, the influence of that, particularly on younger voters, and so on. So we need to factor those into our research going forward. But I think, as I say, the book overall didn't fill me with optimism. But it's really good that we're having some serious analysis so that we can at least diagnose and recognise some of the problems. I think that there's an underlying theme throughout that the survival of democracy is in peril, and a number of chapters refer in their conclusions to countries being at the crossroads. So I want to end off with just 2 points, really, 2 questions, really. One of the issues that comes out of the recent debates in the Namibian Parliament is the quality of leadership, of political leadership. It seems that, in Namibia, but also in other countries, there are hardly any or no moral beacons, and very few good examples that we could promulgate for others to follow. Instead, there does seem to be underlying movement towards authoritarianism. And I think that those of us in civil society, our partners, and the media, and so on, need to defend our civic space. And also, I think in Namibia, where we do have a good degree of civic space, utilize it to the optimum. So we really need to make sure that we guard against growing authoritarianism. So the last questions I want to ask is, where is the leadership? One of the quotes that came to me as I was watching the parliamentary debate last week was from W.B. Yeats. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So if the best are going to stay quiet or not raise the relevant and pertinent issues, the worst will get away with what they are getting away with now in Namibia, which is virulent hate speech and so on, and very under-democratic language. So I think the issue is also, where is the quality of leadership? And then allied to that, where are the youth? Where are the youth at the moment? Are they going to be able to take us forward in terms of democratic process and progress on democratic consolidation? Are they lost in a world of, social media that's not actually relevant very much to Namibian politics? Or are they lost to a world of survivalism? Because the poor, many of the poor obviously are also the young, because our demographics show that 21%, half the population is under 21. So they're also severely affected by poverty and inequality and employment. And do they have the possibilities of getting involved in democracy as activists if they are just trying to battle from day to day for survival? So, not very reassuring at the end, but I do think this book gives us a lot of vital information and analysis, and which enables us to start to answer some of these really pertinent questions and face Namibia, but the region as a whole. So I'll end off there. Thanks very much.